this is my year 9. Wave, you know. They have come up with a list of questions that they're going to ask you, but I just thought before we did that, you could maybe tell them a bit about you and what you do.
Okay, well, I work as a military historian. My interest in history began with my 2 grandmothers, who were both young girls during the First World War, one in the East End of London and one in Colchester in Essex, which was a place where there were many military hospitals with the wounded coming back from the Somme. And she could remember these guys. And she had a brother and 10 cousins who all went off the war. And only her brother came back. The others were all killed. So she had her own lost generation of young men who disappeared into the trenches of the First World War. And I really grew up on her stories of those men. And so I used to read anything and everything connected with military history. When I was your age, every comic I read had war stories in it. Every film on the television was about World War One or World War Two. And most of the toys we played with were plastic kits of tanks and aircraft and model soldiers and things like that. So it's always been there one way or another. Then I did history at university, and after university I did a master's degree in history, and I've been lucky to work in history as a career ever since, either doing research or taking battlefield tours, taking groups of people around former battlefields from the 2 world wars, and also working in television, making TV programs about military history. So that's working with channels like the BBC and Channel 4 in the UK, doing programs about, for example, last year, the Battle of the Somme. And one of the most popular history-related programs on the television in Britain is Who Do You Think You Are?, where they get famous people and they trace their family tree. And I end up doing quite a few of those, most recently last year with, well, I'm not even sure what her full name is now, Cheryl Cole she was, but people like that. And so it's an interesting job. You get to meet a variety of different people, and you can uncover some incredible stories. And it's great to have a job that is your passion. It's not just like going into an office every day, although I do that occasionally, but it's much more than that. It's great to have something that you live and breathe that is also what you do for a living.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. That's brilliant. So, obviously at the moment, I think I've told you this already, but the students so far have been studying World War One, and they have looked at the causes of World War One, how soldiers were fighting, and so on. And at the moment, they are focusing on the Battle of the Somme and whether they think the generals were competent or not. So they've come up with a list of questions. So I'm going to ask each student to just say hello, and then they're going to fire a question at you that they've come up with, and maybe you can try and answer it. And then they might ask you more questions. So there might be other people who want to ask you questions based on your answer. So first question is from Paula.
Do you think that General Haig deserves the title of the Butcher of the Somme?
Do you think that General Haig deserves the title Butcher of the Somme?
That's a good question, and a question that has occupied historians for many, many years. It's interesting when you look at Haig, he commanded the biggest army Britain has ever sent to a war. It was a ginormous army, the British Army in 1916, and even bigger by the end of the war. And the men who served under him generally thought that he was a good commander. And that reputation stayed up until really the time of his death, 10 years after the end of the war, when a lot of people, particularly politicians connected with the war, began to write a different story. And this is one of the problems of history, is that you have lots of different voices. One source telling you one thing, one source telling you another thing. So what's the truth? And that is the eternal question of history. It's weaving your way through those sources to find out which version of history is the most credible. And in some respects, that applies to how we look at things today. I mean, all of you will have been watching events in America, and the whole concept of fake news In many respects, the skills that you learn as an historian are useful in trying to understand those sort of things as well. So coming back to Haig, Haig was a man of his time. Generals of the First World War, like Haig, commanded these vast armies in a period in which technology advanced greatly. So weapons went from fairly primitive weapons at the beginning of the war to poison gas, to tanks, to much better aircraft, the ability to fly those aircraft into the enemy's country and bomb their home territory, which Germany did to Britain, and by the end of the war, Britain did to Germany. A massive period of change, and they commanded technology that was as cutting edge as anything you guys have got with you there in the classroom today. But one thing was missing in what they did, and it was communication. They didn't have radio. They certainly didn't have mobile phones. They had static telephones, and by that what I mean is they had telephones connected up by wire. Now, when you're back home, I'm sure in your houses even today, you've still got a telephone that's plugged into a socket in the wall somewhere, and that telephone is connected through a whole system of wiring to telephones pretty much everywhere in the world. And on the battlefield, they had a similar system. And you can imagine that if you're a general trying to talk to someone in the front line, there's a lot of telephone cable between you and that person. And what's happening on the battlefield? Shelling. There's lots of artillery fire going on, and the cable gets cut, and you can't talk to anybody. So you don't know what's coming back. So, and you've got no radio to communicate. So what can you use instead? You have to use runners, human beings, to send messages. And human beings can get killed. Those human beings can also stand somewhere and use flags to signal messages back, but they can be killed doing that. You've got dogs that carry messages and run through the trenches pretty fast, but even dogs can be killed. And there are pigeons. You can put a little message in a little pod around a pigeon's leg and fly that pigeon back to headquarters. But the pigeon doesn't wear a gas mask. And if the Germans are using gas, it flies through a gas cloud and the poor old pigeon drops out of the sky dead. The message never arrives. So what I'm trying to say is that it was very difficult for men like Haig to actually control what their troops were doing or even know what their troops were doing. And when you read, for example, Haig's diary about the first day of the Battle of Somme, now if any of you have researched that, you'll know that was the most catastrophic day of the First World War for Britain, with over 57,000 casualties. If you read his diary, it sounds like the battle was a success. But that's because it probably took 7 to 10 days for him to get the right information back to him so he knew what was happening. So whereas now, commanders who commanded troops, for example, recently in Afghanistan or Iraq, could do that from an office in Washington or London and send orders instantly direct to the men. They could have troops with cameras on their helmets right on the battlefield, seeing exactly what was happening when they were up against an enemy. 100 years ago in the Great War, in the First World War, General Haig could not do that. So it meant that you had to rehearse everything, and when a plan went wrong, there was no way of changing it. And the catastrophe of the first day of the Somme was due to poor planning, was due to too much faith in the ability of artillery to destroy everything, and also a failure of intelligence. They didn't know the Germans were so deeply dug in on the Somme, protected from this shell fire. But the communication aspect is a really important one, because a general is only as good as his ability to actually speak to his troops on a battlefield. So 100 years on, our generals can speak to anybody, anywhere. 100 years before Haig, generals like Wellington, when, for example, Wellington was fighting in Spain in the Peninsular War against the French, he was actually on the battlefield. He wasn't in a big house miles away. He was on horseback, right on the battlefield at Talavera, Salamanca, Badajoz, commanding his troops verbally, giving verbal orders, talking to them. 100 years later, with the size of the British Army on the Somme, that wasn't possible. and technology 100 years later from the Somme makes that possible. So that's a really important aspect. So was he a butcher? It's an unfair title, really, because he could only command with the tools and equipment and communication methods that he had. And the First World War was a war in which everyone was prepared for war in 1914, but just not that war, because it was a unique war. And both sides spent much of the rest of the war trying to figure out how to win it. And arguably, Britain, under General Haig, under his command, was the only ones that really understood that and were able to do it by the end of the war.
So that was a fantastic answer, Paul. Thanks. I was just going to ask you, do you think it's fair when people say, "Oh, the generals were never on the front line and they were never there"? Is that fair criticism or not?
It's an easy criticism to make because soldiers know that when they sleep in a muddy trench and when the rain comes down and pings off their steel helmet, they're wet, they're soaked, they're cold, they're hungry, and there's some big fat officer 50 miles away in a big house and he's safe. But a general's job is not to be in a frontline trench with a rifle. A general's job is to look at the big picture and then make decisions based on intelligence. And he can't do that in a trench because he can't see anything. I mean, you guys are in your classroom now. You have no idea what's happening outside your classroom or in the next street. And it's just the same on a battlefield. You have a very, very small view of what you're seeing. And a general needs to see the bigger view. And the only way you can do that is to be in a position where you can get lots of intelligence. They used air photos, for example, very extensively in the First World War, where pilots would fly over the battlefield and take aerial photographs, and that would almost instantly come back to headquarters for information to be passed on. But you needed a big place to have all these people reading this intelligence, looking at these photographs, and then the general to sit down with them all and discuss it. And you can't do that on a battlefield.
Paula, did that answer your question? Do you have any other questions based on? Does anybody have any questions based on that answer? Or are you happy to move on, guys? Oh, Luis does. This is Luis. Hang on, I'll show you Luis. Wait a minute. There's Luis. Wave, Luis. Go on.
Do you think that if communication was better, war could end before?
So ask that again.
So if the communication were better?
When?
In World War I?
Than when?
No,
if
it was
communications were better,
would it hadn't
earlier.
Would what have happened earlier?
No, communication. Yeah.
if the communication
So if the communication
was
better,
could the war
Oh, right, okay, I see, right. If communications had been better, would the war have ended earlier? Is the question, I think.